hear us. We'll just do our testing from our end. If you, please send us a message if you're having any trouble at all being able to hear us. And if you can mute your microphones from your end, we're doing it from our end. It just stops all the white noise that people can hear. So just mute your own microphones, and we're just about to begin. If you give us a moment. All right, looks like we're okay. Well, welcome. And talking about shame, it's one of the specialties, I think, of South Pacific Private. It is one of those subjects that I think that people either come to SPP very deliberately to deal with, or that they find out when they're here that the toxic version of shame is one of those experiences, and I say experience especially at a toxic shame level, that drives, it's been driving them for many years, and that they mightn't have known it. So for those folks that might be tuning in or tuning in after this event and wondering who we are, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about South Pacific Private. We've been running now for we're in, I think, our 21st year now, and we've been working in the northern beaches of the east coast of Australia, running a treatment program that was inspired by the Meadows in Arizona. And so we are now just having a little technical thing here on our end. We're just going to move our way through the slides. But what we've got for you tonight, I suppose, is looking at shame and how to deal with shame and recovery. So for you folks that have been through our program, we have an inpatient program at South Pacific, and we can do it as an evening or a day program. And when you come here, we will initially help you with your secondary symptoms in our model, things like depression, anxiety, and addictions. But for anyone that has come through SPP, they know very quickly we start to look at the primary symptoms, the core of what we learned as children, that we need to be comfortable in our own skin. And so where shame fits in as in this cycle of life is simply an awareness of having a sense of self, where we can track the impacts of our own behaviours with others. So what I want to do now is take you right through what are we going to look at today in looking at shame. So we're going to provide awareness about the role of shame, and in our development and with our addictions and mental health issues, what its relationship is, and how it sort of supports those primary symptoms driving the secondary symptoms. We're going to look at an explanation of shame and look at how, when we've got healthy shame, that we could have I suppose it helps us be accountable, and it lets us know that we're not God, that we're not the center of the universe. So I'm just getting some feedback here that you couldn't hear me, so I'll just lift it up a little bit like that. That might be better. We want to learn about the difference between shame, guilt, and carried shame and induced shame, so the difference between having that healthy shame and then receiving shame from outside of ourselves, and how that impacts us. And I suppose different sorts of shame binds. When you come into recovery, that one of the quotes I've always liked is a Carl Jung quote, and he says that if we don't make the unconscious conscious, we'll live it, we'll let it direct our life, and we'll call it fate. And I think shame is one of those emotions, until it's brought out into the open, and we're given a lot of support to deal with it. It is one of those toxic feelings that drives us into our secondary symptoms. And as our model says, once we're in those secondary symptoms, we will start to experience crisis after crisis. We will experience unmanageability, and then as an impact on all our relationships. So, where to from here? John Bradshaw would be one of the driving forces when we started to look at shame, I suppose, at South Pacific. With Bradshaw, he says in his own words that he stands on the shoulders of giants when he started to write about shame. To be shame-bound means that whenever you feel any feeling, need, or drive, you immediately feel ashamed. The dynamic core of your human life is grounded in your feelings, needs, and drives. So when these are bound by shame, you are shamed to the core. And that's from Bradshaw's Healing the Shame That Binds You. It's interesting to hear John still talk about shame these days and the effects of where we got that toxic shame. When I work with clients around shame, one of the things that just astounds me, it was a saying that Bradshaw said that when we're in a toxic shame or we're bound by it, we have what they call a shame attack. It will stop us to the core, and we cease to be a spontaneous human being. And when we look at those functional adult skills that South Pacific teaches, that spontaneity is one of those really necessary abilities in life, to be able to be in the moment, respond to incoming data in the moment. So when we have shame, it is the toxic level of shame is what stops us in that moment from being able to move forward. So when we talk about the primary symptoms, what are we talking about? Self-esteem, boundaries, reality, and we're talking about Pia Melody's version of reality, body, thoughts, feelings, and behavior, dependency issues, and moderation issues. And as we go through this webinar, we'll be looking at how, when we've got induced or carried shame, it attaches itself to those parts of our system and how it then impacts us moving on in our recovery. And a lot of people even come to SPP in recovery after many years, knowing that their developmental trauma is what's actually stopping them moving forward in any real happiness. They might even have long-term sobriety or long-term clean time in one of the 12-step fellowships, but yet they're not experiencing happiness at depth. So, the truth about shame. Shame is an emotion. As with the other emotions, shame is generated from one's thoughts or what one thinks. Now, if you listen now to the neurobiologists, they talk very much about how when the amygdala, there you go, fires, and how it creates that the right hemisphere of the brain, which is where this is seated, fires up. We then experience emotions before we can think. When our survival instincts fire, we will experience that toxic level of shame before we can think. For the purpose of recovery and for the purpose of this webinar, we'll be looking at, once we get that awareness of that shame, our core beliefs will start to kick in. And then we can get a lot of value from looking at what are some of those beliefs and what are some of the ways we're attaching meaning to the experience that's now fired inside of us. But there is, one thing I profoundly believe at SPP is that not everybody is codependent. Not everybody is affected by developmental trauma. There's plenty of folks out there that had an experience where they grew up in an environment that was relatively safe, that their experience of their major caregivers was one of warm regard, and that they were able to have the ability to function, and so they developed inherent worth, decent boundaries, a sense of themselves, and as their needs and wants developed, they were met, they were taught to meet them themselves, and then they got supported to meet them and move on in a spontaneous way. I do believe those people exist. I know that there's some contention sometimes in the recovery field that everybody must be affected by developmental trauma. I'm not saying that people didn't have to overcome challenging moments in their life, but if those fundamental building blocks there, then shame will be a healthy emotion within that. And shame is generated when a person becomes aware of making a mistake or being fallible and believes that another person is aware of it. And that's what defines it as different from guilt. It's a public emotion. If I was it's an interesting thing talking to a screen in a webinar. If I was to lecture on this, I could see the embarrassed looks on your faces. But one of the examples I remember hearing about healthy shame is driving along in your car and picking your nose. And if that's all right with your value system and no one else knows, you can live with it. But as soon as you stop at the lights and look to your right and see a whole family looking over at you with their jaws dropped, all of a sudden there could be some mild embarrassment if you've got healthy shame. And if you've got toxic shame, it could be the trigger of a shame attack, that somehow your fallibility, your humanity has been exposed. And this is the difference, as we get to talk about the difference between shame that is generated from the development that was not traumatic. That healthy shame just lets us know that we're human, we make mistakes, that we're fallible, and it can move us to repair. It can move us to being accountable in the situation and make amends to others. The difference, I suppose, between healthy shame and toxic shame, and I am planting my flag there because that is an argument at the moment where there's no such thing as good shame. I'm not so sure about that. I think one of the things that I remember hearing Pia Melody when she said about childhood trauma is that we when we grow up in an environment where we are learning about our limits and that we need to limit ourselves, that healthy shame just kicks in to let you know not to go too far. It's only when we've been shamed or we're carrying the shame from the dysfunctional family system that we start to feel unwell in our experience of shame. But healthy shame is a mild embarrassment. So shame tells us that we're imperfect, and shame also lets you know that in a situation that you might feel like saying something, you might desperately want to be inappropriate, but your own healthy shame will stop you, and it might mean that you reach out and tell someone that's not going to be negatively impacted by that will be evidence you haven't gone too far. So healthy shame, just as some of the ways to try and locate it. So it differs from guilt, but guilt occurs when a person breaks their own values and operates outside of those values. So if you go to the checkout at the supermarket, you know that the young, inexperienced sort of teenager behind the cash register is giving you too much change. Now, even if you were on a particularly short week, knowing that extra $20 they might have given you could be better suited in your wallet, you might also have the value that you know that teenager is going to add up that till at the end of the day, and they'll be short, and the boss will be talking to them. So that healthy guilt lets you know what, that's not my value. My value is to be honest, and so you'll give that back no matter how you feel. Shame can be felt in the body, and here we talk about how it can be felt in our neck and our face, and we'll see that blushing that can sometimes happen with shame, where your body just betrays you and all of a sudden it's obvious. Now, guilt is different. Guilt is experienced as an annoying sensation in the gut is one of the ways it can be observed. It's not necessarily attached to someone else knowing about the transgression as shame is. However, we can have shame and guilt. We can have a value that we broke and we feel guilt, but we also know that we feel as we move towards that being known by someone else, that we're going to have to own this behavior, that we could feel some shame attached to that as well. But guilt does not make a person feel embarrassed, and that's one of the other defining differences of it. So as we look at carried shame versus our own shame, and this is where I think our SBP, it's one of our specialties, where we get folks to come in and through our changes program or primary group really start to look at what's the difference between having healthy shame that you've developed that is yours versus being in the environment where there's been developmental trauma, neglect, or abuse. When we grow up in a family system where there's mental health issues or addiction issues, and someone's acting shamelessly towards us, or in our presence, then a child, and this is one of the basic building blocks of SBP, is when the child actually feels that they can't leave. There's a state of helplessness. And in childhood, the younger, the more helpless we are. Our narcissism, our self-centeredness of childhood keeps us not only trapped there, unable to leave, but the self-centeredness means that around us and the things that happen in our presence that we take on, that somehow we're co-creating it, and that's so important. Parents have boundaries around children, not that so they're perfect, but in their imperfection they seek support and help outside of that relationship with the child. Some of the ways that we can see and identify shame, and this can be helpful when you come into treatment. It's even the concept of shame can be a bit weird, but as soon as you start to look at, well, how might you observe it in your life? All of a sudden, it comes to life. So some of the little icons we've got up here are giving some shape to that, and I'm going to read some of these because I really want you to get the message that we'll see control in our interpersonal relationships when we're under stress. All of a sudden we need to control that person or the environment and control and overly control ourselves. And in our secondary symptoms, we'd see that as a relational issue of negative control. That rage is a perfect example of toxic shame at its core, or carrying shame coming out. And we certainly define rage here at SPP as that mixture of unfelt, unresolved feelings and that sense of powerlessness in your environment sort of colliding and then coming out. And usually that helps people explain why they can experience a big event and be quite shut down, but all of a sudden later on, as those feelings start to engage with that sense of powerlessness and hopelessness, they can rage at the fact their jumper got caught in the door, or the toaster's burnt, and all of a sudden they're fundamentally overreacting to a situation that simply doesn't need that much emotion. Procrastinating. can be something that a shame-based person really struggles with, where they continue just to keep putting off what they know they need to do today. And that's certainly one of those symptoms of addiction. And we would say that untreated primary symptom, with toxic shame at its core, would be what's driving that. Perfectionism is where you'll see that toxic shame coming out in someone's life, that they need to get it right. And depending on the culture or the environment someone was raised, that perfectionism can look really different. If you come from a sheep shearing shed in Cobar, perfectionism out there might be making sure you knock out 180 sheep in a day, and that it doesn't matter if you've got blisters, and it doesn't matter if your back's sore, that you'll beat anyone else and you'll get more sheep than anyone else. Where perfection in the CBD of Sydney, in a business centre somewhere, that perfection might look radically different. Or perfection in the home might mean that there has to be a perfect house, that there's Mr. Sheen on all the ornaments, that there's always the Hoover going, that there can never be a mess. And so perfection can look radically different, yet driven by the same experience of toxic shame. Depression. So we start to see that those feelings that are unexpressed start to pile up. And it's very hard to tell between a chemical and clinical depression and an environmental depression when they're finally both taken hold. But if we've grown up in an environment where there was a developmental immaturity from trauma, then it doesn't really matter what got us there. Eventually our brain will respond chemically and we will feel this depression. What we look for here at South Pacific is there toxic shame at the core. Addiction and all addictions, and we look at our relationship with addictions as not just the toxic shame that can drive it from developmental trauma, but when we start to act shamelessly with an obsessional and compulsional disease, we can then find ourselves not only having the shame from our trauma, but by the time you hit treatment, you can have enormous shame as a result of who you've chosen to be in your addiction. This can go on for OCD and any form of compulsion. We really look at people where they're at any moderation issue, where they're needing to overdo something to change how they feel. Mightn't become an addiction just yet, but that would certainly where you could see the evidence of that toxic shame. And last but not least, suicidality, with self-harm. People that get to that level of absolute hopelessness. As I said at the beginning of this webinar, it can be that intolerable experience of just being in your own skin. That untreated is what I think Pia Melody, when she talks about this model of developmental immaturity, says it's not heroin addiction that kills people, it's not alcoholism that kills people, it's not depression that kills people, it's this model, it's this overall picture, and at its core is toxic shame. So, if I'm going to mention developmental impact and trauma so much in this webinar, I better explain it a little bit. So when a child is shamed for being imperfect or for being who they are, shame becomes bound to what is being shamed about in that child. So just think about that for a second. There's no doubt that when you deliver this sort of material, you instantly think, well, parenting it is simply the hardest job on earth. And why it's the hardest job on earth is because as human beings, we are fallible. We make mistakes ourselves, and we need enormous support sometimes just to live in our own skin. When we're raising children, through the different stages, and if people hear me lecture here at SPP, my little ones are now 3.5 and 14 months, and their developmental immaturity is, they are immature because they're young. And it's so easy under stress to feel tempted to make those comments in a family system and to impact them, and how much you need to seek other adults as support to be able to de-stress and stay in your moderation. So what we look at with developmental immaturity around our body, around our thoughts, around our feelings, and around our behaviours is just how when someone acts shamelessly around us, whether they're in an addiction, have a mental health issue, have intimacy issues, that a child will carry the shame. It's that simple. They haven't got the filtering system to keep it out, and their narcissism draws it to them like gravity. They do not have the ability to differentiate and say, wow, you're having a bad day. That's developed over time. And what we know from the adverse childhood experience study that's happened in the USA, that one of the phenomenons about trauma is that we think that it's got to be the physical abuse or the child sexual abuse that is where most of this damage happens. And from their studies of 17,000 people in one of their studies, they've recognized that it's actually not. It's the ongoing humiliation was equally as important and equally showed up in how people talked about trauma and what really impacted them. Now, what happens in a family system when a child is shamed and they can't keep it out, they take it on? And I think Bradshaw, in Healing the Shame That Binds You, tried to explain what that looks like. And in our model here at SPP, we work within that framework of looking at in someone's history and their trauma history around their physical body, about their needs for medical help, dental help, physical nurturing needs. If you're ashamed about any of those, the child will take that on. Around intellectual abuse, if a child's thinking's attacked or they're shamed about their thinking or not shown how to problem solve and learn the rules of the culture and society, a child can carry that shame around their thinking. There's something wrong with them. About any of the feelings, those primary feelings we talk about here at SPP, if we're shamed for having any particular feeling or all feelings, basically we can carry a shame bind around that, and same with behaviours. So if you think of age-appropriate development, children in their absolute immaturity can, around a family that's functioning in pain, draw towards them some incredibly adverse experiences. And I think that's the thing when we're talking about toxic shame, is just what the powerlessness a child has about that environment in keeping that out, that in actual fact that the person that needs the filter, hold the filter for them, is their parent or their guardian. And when that is not in place, they can't help but carry it on. So then when that happens developmentally, what we will observe in our recovery is that underneath our addictions, underneath our mental health issues, is in regards to what we would call our functional adult development, we can have shame bound to all of those areas. And if we talk about self-esteem, one of the defining characteristics for me that tells me that there is functional people in the world is that there is folks that have inherent worth. We've been training a lot of new staff here at SPP, and some of those folks do therapy as an occupation. They have an interest in it. They've gone and got their studies, and they've come to SPP, and we're really happy to have them on board. And recently I was saying to them, please, if you haven't got a claim of addiction, I'm a recovering addict myself, that's fantastic. You're evidence that functional people exist. And so healthy self-esteem for folks is that just that inherent worth, that their worth does not go up and down due to their mistakes. They'll feel mild embarrassment. They will be able to work through that feeling and move on, but the stock in themselves never goes down. So when someone comes to SPP with developmental trauma, then they'll have a self-esteem shame bind. So around their value, they can feel shame. I worked with someone recently that was able to share a level with me that when I affirmed them, they were impacted by that. And that they needed to say that because whenever they were praised, it created shame. And they were able to practice that by sharing their reality with me. I was very happy to hear it. It was a wonderful level to hear because by being able to own that that's what was going on, the shame could be reduced and that praise could actually get in. And that they sort of can build our self-esteem once we can identify shame. But in the beginning, when we first identified it, it's truly awful. Being a public emotion, shame gets triggered when we're around others. So in our recovery, in group work, at lectures, and in therapy, it's going to get triggered here. So even when we make progress, we can feel bad. Boundaries is another thing that I'd like to speak about. Whenever a parent is acting shamelessly, either towards us or around us when we're little, a child will carry that shame. And what we don't learn is boundaries. So we don't usually learn to have good physical boundaries, good sexual boundaries and good internal boundaries, meaning that I can filter what I think and feel, and I can keep your thoughts and feelings out and mine in. When we're a child, we need a parent to do that. In therapy, when we start to set boundaries with others, the big thing that happens, and Pia Melody outlines this in a boundaries information and facing codependence, is that we will feel more shame in the beginning of our recovery. She talks about, I suppose, early recovery being a joy-pain experience, that we can feel joy that finally we found a place to be and to get help. But the shame comes from whenever I set a boundary, I haven't really developed yet that belief that it's okay for me to claim that for myself. So in early recovery, as we start to share our reality and set boundaries with others, we will actually feel worse for a while. It will trigger our toxic shame, and that will be something that only practice and it will help us reduce that shame. In regards to our reality, our body, our thoughts, feelings, and behaviour, and how we process information from outside of us. For some folks, they'll have, as I mentioned before, a shame bind connected to a part of that, whether they were shamed about their physical body, thoughts, feelings, or behaviours. But for others, if you were fundamentally shamed, if your reality was shamed, any time you tried to express it, you as a whole person was shamed. And that shame, as I said before, can we can be shamed, and we can have it induced into us, or if we're around people acting shamelessly, we'll carry that shame. On both accounts, it can be fundamentally disorientating. And one of the things that helped me as I started to work with folks around this and deal with my own shame binds was it can feel like you don't know your true north on your own compass, that you can end up being quite disorientated when you're in that shame. And starting to work through that can be a revelation for folks, because so I think healing the shame that binds you can be an amazing experience when you start to become free of it. The behavioural shame bind I've talked about before, but and the dependency one, though, is a worthy one to talk about. The fourth core area of need in childhood and in our functional adult development. If we were shamed about having need, those 9 areas of need, but physical, intellectual, emotional, spiritual needs, the needs for food, water and shelter, for dental care, medical care, if any of those needs were shamed, and including our wants, the things that were our personal preferences, that what can happen in someone's life in early recovery is that we will, whenever those needs arise, we can have a shame bind around it. And I think one of the examples we'll give in our lectures here is if you were shamed about physical touch or wanting physical touch, that as an adult, if you feel like a hug or someone goes to hug you, you can actually have triggered a shame bind, that it's not okay to have that need. And that would be seen as a dependency shame bind regarding a physical, that physical part of the nurturing. So as we move on and we think about recovery and dealing with shame in recovery, I always run the risk here at SBP whenever I lecture on any of our functional adult skills and moving forward is to make sure that the message is one that can be achievable. What I mean by that is that I want people to feel hope. I mean, I've had a long-term recovery experience, and I remember being in treatment. I remember the fear, the not knowing, how are you going to move forward? And I remember it took years before I got to the impacts of developmental trauma. That's what excites me about the SPP program, that we bring people into their awareness of the effects of their trauma really early in recovery. And so one of the, I suppose, realities of early recovery is that you will feel worse before you feel better. And that's an interesting dilemma. I think I heard it said once in a Narcotics Anonymous tape, a fellow said that when he got into recovery, he felt like he was being dragged behind a bus, but eventually by being here for a while, he learned to smile while he's being dragged. Pia Melody says that we trudge the road to happy destiny, and the trudging that she talks about, that oxymoron of, well, how come you can trudge towards a happy destiny? Well, this model, when it talks about shame and toxic shame versus healthy shame, if we are shame-based, what can happen is that any movement towards looking after ourselves our body, our thoughts, our feelings, our behavior, any need that we go, any wants that we want to sort of bring into our life, we can actually feel more shame. I've always identified with Pia when we start to share a level with somebody and then set a boundary. When you're sharing your reality, if you're shame-bound, the key message will be that's not okay. And to do it, we can either do it from a wounded child where we feel too vulnerable and too needy and we'll feel bad and flawed fundamentally in that shame, or we'll live in the reaction to that shame, which is we go to that good and perfect, needless and wantless, in control, and both cause damage interpersonally. They'll lead to addictions, they'll lead to mental health issues, they'll lead to crisis and unmanageability. But when Pia talks about this model as a whole, she says that really it's about disconnecting and connecting, that our developmental trauma threw us in, through the way our brain and neurobiology formed, into surviving instead of thriving. That our neurosystem was regularly being triggered and into a place where we felt helpless and needed to use those survival instincts. And that repeats itself. Whenever our brain starts to develop in that way, it attaches itself to all the systems within our body. And then we will repeat that whenever we have a similar experience in our adult life. And that's why at South Pacific we come together and we say, look, let's get you into recovery from your mental health issue, and let's get in recovery from whatever that addiction is, and let's find those other ones that are hidden underneath there. Once we get that happening, we really want to work on people's developmental trauma, because it's this toxic level of shame that can drive people, once they give up their drugs of addiction, to need to escape how they feel. So all of a sudden you're going on okay, but you have a shame attack due to one of your shame binds, and you're back into that acute need to change how you feel. So what we try and do here is get people to be able to work with an aftercare recovery plan that's ongoing, that's extensive, that doesn't just have one day program a week. And I'm forever encouraging people that addictional mental health is observable in your life every day. You'll see the patterns of behavior, the patterns of thinking, the feeling states every day. So recovery needs to reflect that. And so whenever we leave SPP, we want you to have an aftercare plan that's extensive, that there's a lot of recovery opportunities, right from a morning reading to journaling to prayer to a serenity prayer when you're under stress, to mindfulness exercises, to attending one-on-one therapy, 12-step support, ongoing therapy groups. You're combating a disease of the brain here. You're combating something that's been all-pervasive. So having an aftercare plan that follows that, it can never be too much in early recovery. Continuing to level, we're right in the middle of finally changing leveling to being called sharing your reality here, which really just states what that is. So one of the great tools in identifying shame is our leveling, sharing your reality process. That whenever you have a reaction, a big reaction, or no reaction at all to a significant event, doing a level on it will help you identify where your shame core is fired. We get you to look at the core beliefs. And with the model here at SPP, when we look at core beliefs, our core beliefs will reflect those core issues that children need to develop. It'll either be about our self-esteem, our boundaries, our ability to protect and contain ourselves, our reality, body, thoughts, feelings, and behavior, or our dependency needs. So once we can identify those, instantly we can seek the support we need with our functional adults, so we can actually move towards good health. And in early recovery, trying to get yourself out of the same hole you've just fallen in on your own, I believe, is really unnecessary. One of the great gifts people share when they come to SPP, when they do their testimony, is just how important the recovery community was in them getting well. And what we know about that is that therapists, we need to be your champions. One of my mentors always said, I've got to be your biggest fan when I'm helping you. And I certainly know when I've gone to and seen good therapists that I've returned to time and time again, I've felt that warm regard. And what we call that here at SPP is reparenting. So if I can learn to level, I'll get the data I need that tells me what support I need. And therefore, if I've got a sponsor or a good therapist, they can help me start to reduce the shame. If a therapist can do that, then when we're in a community that can also hear us when when we need to name those things we felt shame about. We can practice reducing that shame over time. So please, as you're in your recovery, don't give up on that idea of leveling. Even if you can't share it with someone, getting the information for yourself is important. Identifying your shame binds. Through therapy, if you can work out through doing your history work, some of you might have done that with your changes program here, is where do I attach my shame? I know for me it was enormously helpful to find a lot of my shame was attached to need, my dependency needs, and also my physical body. As a child, food was the first drug, compulsive overeating, still something I deal with in my recovery today. And how important it was to know that whenever I felt myself in that compulsive eating and my body weight went up, that I would feel shame about that because I was shamed about that when I was a child. To identify that in early recovery, be able to start to love and give myself warm regard and affirm myself no matter what the scale said was a really big gift in early recovery because feeling that toxic shame, shutting me down was a tool that was just part of the ongoing trauma. So whenever I'm working with anyone here at SPP, it's what are your shame binds around your body, thoughts, feelings, behaviour, around our core issues, the self-esteem, boundaries, dependency issues, and if you can start to identify them when they fire, it can then lead you to that next step, which is reaching out and asking for support. The other thing is that we then get people to start to manage their own state. I love our concept of creating a functional adult, that we need to grow ourselves up in recovery. And in AA, you'll hear them say, Alcoholics Anonymous, to say grow up or die, that we need to move forward and grow those functional skills. So whenever we identify shame, doing the therapy, doing the shame reduction work, doing the trauma, developmental trauma and trauma release work can really help us get rid of the effects of the shame that we carry. But then starting to develop our own self-soothing techniques, using mindfulness and relaxation to be able to reduce the effects of a shame attack when you're in it. And this is a really important part of recovery, that it's great to be able to go to meetings, to pray, to work the steps, to reach out to sponsors, but to be able to grow that skill, that once we notice that we've gone into a hypervigilant state, our nervous system's firing due to a shame attack, that we're able to then really be able to soothe ourselves, to just change how we feel and to look after ourselves. And what we would say our functional adult is able to sort of support that wounded child and adult adapted child within and start that reparenting process. So if this feels hard, to do, I wanted to show you this recovery map. It's a confusing thing to look at the end of a PowerPoint like this because to look at it, it's overwhelming. I just went through some module training with the staff here, and I like this. I like this because it just shows you what you're up against in early recovery. One of the ways of describing recovery is the levels of the onion can come off, and the layers of the onion can come off. Sorry, and this is what that onion looks like when it comes to what we carry if we went through a family system where there was developmental trauma. If you notice right at the beginning, in the middle, that core self, that precious beginning of life, that you can't help but look at a small child and see that just that wonderful energy that they have, and then as they grow, and I think most adult human beings, even the most gruff person at times, can be impacted by the innocence, the vulnerability, and just the shining light of those brand new eyes as they look at life. But if you grew up in a family system that functioned in pain, that had an addiction issue untreated, had a mental health issue untreated, then those folks in our life just had an immaturity of themselves that they were dealing with. And instead of being able to foster that inherent worth, to protect that vulnerable self, to give you identification with your body, thoughts, feelings, and behavior, how to, over time, 0 to 18, grow and develop, and then have your needs met, and then meet those needs yourself, so you can go out in the world with good esteem, good boundaries, a good sense of self, and good self-care, and live in fairly good moderation. Then if that didn't happen, that core self was covered by trauma and the effects of shame. And let me take you back to that phrase of Bradshaw's, that toxic shame is the intolerable experience of being. When we grow up in the family system that have that shame, early on, before 0 to 7, we have very crude defense mechanisms of repression, suppression, and disassociation where the trauma was acute. But then we'll have those family roles that we went into, and these will be webinars that will come up in the future and lectures that we have here, where before our brain fully develops, we can learn to get our needs met in that family system if that family system's functioning in pain and can't meet those needs for us. And you will see those hero roles and scapegoat roles and enabler roles and lost child roles in children early on as they try and desperately get needs met that the family's now incapable of meeting. As we go out in this onion, you'll see that all the defense mechanisms that come up for folks, and then on that outer rim is the different behaviors and addictions and things we can use to medicate how we feel. If we've got toxic shame at our core, we're doing everything we can to escape that feeling, that intolerable experience of being. Recovery is about coming home. Bradshaw in his series, in his book Homecoming, talks about that idea that this functional adult now that finds himself or herself in treatment needs to return home, to go back to that core self and do the repair. I think one of the challenging things in recovery and the recovery that SPP offers is that it's not just about healing your alcoholism or your eating addiction or your mental health issue or depression or anxiety, but it really is about going back to that core and doing that healing. But what we believe that comes as the gifts of doing that is healing the shame that binds you, that you start to let go of that acute sense that there's something fundamentally wrong with you and get the ability to grow that warm regard. I know our general manager, Claire Barber here, came back from the States recently, very excited about the research that promotes ongoing recovery planning for the first 5 years. And here's an exciting thing. Dr. Patrick Cards has talked about this for years. If we can commit to recovery and do the deep work, not just the secondary symptoms but the primary symptoms, and over time continue to turn up, do that reparenting, getting the support from outside, that in 5 years, if we do that work, what we know now statistically is that our chance of relapse falls into the same category as the chance that someone might develop an addiction in their adult life, which i.e. means we're normal again. Doesn't mean we sail on through life with a false grin on our face. We'll still take on the new developmental challenges from whatever age we start recovery. But the fact is they've got that research now that suggests that we can just commit to this. I know 5 years sounds like a long time. But if you start to think of it in terms of anyone you've known that's postponed recovery, that's put it off, or had a relapse and gone back out there for sometimes more than 5 years, it's not that much. We've got a chronic illness. At its core is this shame. And I hope tonight we've been able to, I suppose, just bring it back into your mind, the idea that if you identify with shame, that and especially at that toxic level as a result of developmental trauma, that please don't get disheartened in your recovery. One of the things I say, and this is Steve Stokesism, so SPP probably won't take responsibility for this, but you cannot save your butt and your face at the same time. And that's recovery. And what that means is shame, toxic shame, gets us to hide how we feel, what we think, what we do, stuff about our body, because we somehow are connected that instead of feeling a mild embarrassment that healthy shame gives us, at our core we feel there's something fundamentally wrong with us. What I like about what we offer in treatment here, through developing that functional adult to help us through treatment, getting into recovery for our secondary symptoms, the intimacy that we start to grow, and the reparenting that we do here in regards to our wounds, our toxic shame, and what we did to hide it, our adult adapted child, we start working in those areas over time. We get back to reducing that shame down to where we start to experience that preciousness at our core. And you'll see that in how people live. It's not an idea, it's an experience. So when we do have something come along that triggers that core to fire, we finally do get that experience that we've got inherent worth, that we just did something that was human, that was fallible, but we're okay. And I think that's the gift that recovery can really give us if we can take that risk to share it in the first place. So shame binds will render us powerless in recovery from the primary symptoms until those shame binds are broken. So please don't give up. This is hard work to do, but it's a worthy pursuit to not just have that first recovery from your secondary symptoms, but keep moving and addressing those shame binds, because you can heal from that shame that binds you. That a person's own shame does not completely limit us. It just causes us to limit ourselves. And thank God for healthy shame. It lets me know not to go too far and not impact people negatively and deal with it in a healthy way. Carried shame, however, shuts us down. And it shuts down our reality. And that's what, in early recovery, reaching out to a sponsor, a peer, doing an outreach call in your 12-step fellowship, praying sometimes if there's no one else around, getting online and getting into a meeting that might be offshore somewhere on the other side of the world, just to get that support so we don't have to shut down. And to remember that shame, I suppose I am planting my flag here. I know that at the moment there is that conversation out there that there's no such thing as healthy shame. Well, at the moment we're still here at SPP working with that notion that shame is an important emotion, that there is a healthy shame. We learn it in childhood, in functional families, as a way of limiting ourselves and our reality. And that if a person doesn't experience healthy shame, then they don't have that ability to limit themselves. And when we don't limit ourselves, we risk being an offender, or we risk being a victim to others. And so therefore it's one of those things in recovery that's highly recommended that we start to do that shame reduction so we can get in contact with that healthy shame. You know, when I was thinking about how do you finish something like this on shame before we go to questions, and you know, one of our little catchphrases here that seems to really strike people when they walk in is expect a miracle. When you've got toxic shame at your core, when you feel fundamentally flawed, that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, and you start to learn that was something that you've carried, that it's sad, you'll have to grieve it because that preciousness was injured by shameless behaviour of others. But the fact is, if we can do that work and reduce that shame, eventually we go back to experiencing that preciousness. And of course, you know, that does at times feel like a miracle. I'm always mindful in changes where we do the core of this shame reduction work here at SPP. If you sit in testimonial and listen to people as they affirm their change as therapists, and it doesn't seem to matter who it is, you know, it can be whoever sat in that space and helped you do that shame reduction. It really feels as though they've taken you through something that was amazingly special. And that's that bit where you come to SPP to expect a miracle. When you leave here, folks, you are a miracle. So I hope you've been able to hear that. I hope you've been able to see it. And I suppose we're after some questions now, and I'm trusting my offsiders here will help me to identify these. So we'll move things about here as they help me identify some questions. So if you've got anything that you'd like to type through, you're very welcome to do it. There is a question here of will people be able to watch this later, and we will. We have recorded this, and we will be emailing links to people that signed up to this. So if you had any connection issues at some point, you could certainly watch this at a later date. So I'm just seeing if there's anyone out there, if you're really wanting to type in a question, you're welcome. It looks like that we at the moment that we haven't got any questions coming, and that's okay. If at times, I suppose, if I was to conclude anything, if you've got any questions after this, please email me here at SPP, very happy, or give us a call. Connect up to our Facebook and continue to stay in contact with our we still continue to stay in contact with us because we've got some great alumni things coming up. We've got a question here that's coming through around the PowerPoint. Yes, I'm sure we'll be able to email it out to people. That should be fine. And there's a question here around how do we, if we're going to reduce shame, how do we move on to how do we move on to forgiving the folks that that created the shame? That's a question that I'll speak broadly. I'll speak broadly about that. One of the things I found really helpful in my own recovery and working with clients is that forgiveness, traditionally when I grew up, forgiveness was that I'm going to forgive somebody else for a behavior so they'll feel better. And what I've learned about childhood trauma is that irregardless of where my family is now in my life, and for some folks, some of the trauma was deal breakers. They can't have contact. That they can work, once we work through trauma and work to reduce the shame we carried from the offenders, that offending behaviour. And there's two things that come to mind as I say this. One, that for first child heroes out there, there can be that fear that I'll be disloyal if I give my shame back. And in therapy, sometimes we'll do that shame reduction by giving shame back to the folks that were acting shamelessly. So when it comes down to forgiveness can be something that I do for myself after working through shame and doing my developmental sort of trauma work, because I no longer want to carry that resentment anymore. It's not about forgiving the behaviour. If someone's behaviour impacted us in a negative way in our developing years, it's not about saying that was okay. Forgiveness is something that's driven by the person in recovery after they've done the work, so they can move on. I heard it said by a practitioner once called Carolyn Myss, who wrote some books on woundology, and she said that it's important that we've only got so much energy in any given day, and in that day, I don't want to keep some of that energy I have is resentment to the past, and therefore forgiveness is a way of giving me access in this day, as I live here now, to my full capabilities and potential, and I've always liked that. Self-soothing. I'm going to go through a couple of questions. Could making amends in accordance with the 12th step be a form of shame reduction? Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Thank you for that. We're only talking about that today in some of our executive meetings. We were talking about step 4 and how in step 4 we can identify how we've impacted others. I think when we're talking about toxic shame carrying from our development, that we shame we need to reduce through therapy and through journaling. But when we get onto our own shameless behaviour, and that's what I like about that question is, once we've had that developmental trauma and we haven't learned limits, we will have evidence in our adult life of where we've acted shamelessly. That's what's so challenging about Pia's model. We come here to heal ourselves and look at where we've been, where we've impacted others negatively. And I think absolutely the 12 steps and doing a step 9 and if you're not in, please, if you're out there listening to me and you've got depression and anxiety, please don't think the 12 steps can't be for you. There's a wonderful book here called The 12 Steps to Happiness by Joe Hass. Great resource. And you can do it as a recovering person with your primary symptoms. And the other thing I'll plug here right now too is we're just about to start in a couple of weeks' time the Breaking Free group, which Pia uses from her Facing Codependence book and the Breaking Free workbook. You work through the 12 steps to heal from your history, from exactly what I'm talking about tonight. So if you're interested about that, please email me here at South Pacific. There's a couple of other questions there about self-soothing. I can give you a fantastic thing to use publicly, and I just did this. With a couple of hundred people in a conference centre, all looking at me up on a stage. And I learned this from a compassion fatigue expert called J. Eric Gentry. Look him up in the net. Lovely man, a recovering person, but he goes around the world talking about compassion fatigue. There's two things we can do to soothe ourselves in the moment that can give us a very easy tool. And one is mindfulness, breathing. Whenever we go into shame, it's very similar to a panic attack shame. We can our breath goes up in the top part of our lungs. Our nervous system starts to go into a hypervigilance. So we can learn to physically relax the body through mindfulness. One way is simply bringing our attention to our breath. And you can bring your attention to your breathing and still look straight ahead at somebody and just breathe down into our diaphragm. Sometimes helpful to just put your hand on your belly. Even without just putting your hands on your lap in front of you can be a helpful thing to do. The other one is, Eric talks about a peripheral eye exercise, that as you look at somebody, you can just notice. And if you're there listening right now, still looking at me on the screen, thank you for hanging with me. But look at the screen and look directly at what's in front of you and focus on something right in front of you. And keeping that direction with your sight, bring your awareness, your vision right out to your peripheral. So even put your hands there, even catch as far as you can, but you're still looking straight ahead. One of the exercises you know about soothing the neurosystem is if I can take my hypervigilance from in front of me and bring it out here and in here and out here as I'm in the presence of someone where my stress is going up, that can be very helpful. The other one is in regards to our pelvic floor muscles. So anyone out there that's been to parenting prenatal classes, you're already with me. It's relaxing a part of our body, and Eric uses a little exercise where he gets you to form like a neon square that sort of goes between the bones at the top of your legs and your hip bones, and you create this square where you literally go from across from your hips and then down. You sit on your hands, and you can do this because in the privacy of your own home, folks, I've got people out there doing this in a whole workshop in front of each other, but you can sit on your hands, feel up to those bones that are up in your gluteus maximus. Once you've got those, imagine a line connecting them. Then you grab your hands, jazz hands, put them on your hips, and get another line and connect it up as a square. Now, in the presence of others, if you can get that image of that sort of square, as you gently breathe into your diaphragm, deep into your body, and imagine that square going in and out. Now, this is an odd exercise to do, and you might want to practice it before you do it in public because you look a bit weird. But one of the things you can do as a therapist is that peripheral vision and relaxing that core pelvic muscle, and they believe the effects it has on our nervous system is it will take us out of an anxious reaction where our body gets into hypervigilance and draws us into more of a relaxed state. When we're in a toxic shame attack, getting that relaxation can be the key thing to just trigger us out of that physical reaction to the trauma. So I hope some of that is helpful. Shame can be felt in the form of fear, absolutely. I think I wouldn't give healthy fear a bad name. I think healthy fear, there's a real gift in healthy fear, meaning that the fear you're feeling is as big as the situation you're in. But panic attacks and anxious reactions, absolutely, I think toxic shame can be the core of that. I've got a question here. It's if we go to someone's house and it dents my esteem so bad and I can't function as I think my house and life is terrible, is that shame? So let me get this. If I go to someone's house and it dents my self-esteem so bad that I can't function, as I think my house and life is terrible, is that shame? When I feel like this, I'm get really overwhelmed and want to harm myself. Absolutely. I think, interestingly, I saw the other day on about social media that for some folks love Facebook and tweeting and all that, but let's look at Facebook as an example. They talk about people being on Facebook, and if you're shame-based, you can watch other people's magnificent lives, and all of a sudden there's something fundamentally wrong with yours. And I think that house example is another. If I see others in a place that looks like they're doing better than me, one of the exercises in the Breaking Free book is looking at self-esteem, a low self-esteem issue, which is one of the key things that comes from developmental trauma, which is shame-based, when I feel toxically ashamed of my value as a person. Then I can either have low self-esteem less than or low self-esteem better than. So if I go into someone's house and judge them as better than me, I can see myself as less than. And absolutely that can be a reaction to shame. Just to remind people of the name, I was asked, I'll re-mention the name of the fellow with the shame reduction was J. Eric Gentry, Gentry, a practitioner from the USA. So he was the fellow that looked at those self-soothing, aspects. I will say, in that example of the house, one of the things that Pia Melody, when she first started writing on codependence, she identified boundaries, and she said, if you can identify poor boundaries, and that's that idea of walking into and getting triggered in any way from data outside of you, and all of a sudden it triggers you into worthlessness. Pia said that the first skill we've got to develop in our functional adult is boundaries. If you're out there listening to me now, and your boundaries can be that damaged, that at your core you feel the need to self-harm, and you get to a state of worthlessness and hopelessness where you do get that suicidal ideation, Pia absolutely, fundamentally, and I agree, says get help. Get help, because that's just toxic shame. We can reduce it, we can heal from it, but not alone. And this is the kicker. To deal with that developmental trauma and the shame that was a result of that, the toxic shame, we have to come out of the shadows and bring it out and into the light. But do it with trusted people. One of the mistakes people make with toxic shame is we reach out to folks that re-shame us and re-traumatize us. Please bring that to either a health professional or a therapist, or certainly contact us here at South Pacific. I'm going to wind up shortly, but I will say that Breaking Free group, yes, at the moment we did advertise it was going to start 2 weeks ago, but the attempts I'm making right now to get it underneath the health fund. So please, our social media and our emails, as soon as I'm able to confirm that the Breaking Free group will go ahead where people can use their health insurance, I should have that within a week's time, the answer on that, and very excited, so we should come under that. So I suppose, look, folks, thank you very much for listening. There's so much I can always, anyone that knows me here at SBP, there's so much I can always talk about recovery. I do hope this has been helpful for you folks out there that have shame. And remember, please don't give up. Don't give up 5 minutes before that miracle happens. You can trust that. So thank you very much, and you will get the links to this webinar and the PowerPoints coming out in an email. So thank you, and bye for now.